In honor of World Water Day, which is coming up this Saturday, March 22nd, we will be talking today about microplastics in our water. My name is Janine Shepard, and I am Food and Water Watch's Senior Manager of Philanthropy Events. I'll be your host today, and I'm honored to be here with so many people. Thank you so much for joining us. As people are joining, please go ahead and put your name in the chat. Tell us where you're coming from, what brings you here today. If you're new to Food and Water Watch, welcome. We are a national organization fighting for sustainable food, clean water, and a livable climate for all. We organize for grassroots activism at all levels of government, local, state, and federal, and we work to create the change and the solutions we need. This year marks our 20th anniversary, and we are proud to have 20 years of wins for clean food, clean water, and a livable climate. We recently published a summary of our organizational strategic plan for the next 4 years that includes focusing on access to clean and affordable water, forcing the Environmental Protection Agency to monitor microplastics in our drinking water, resisting regulatory rollbacks of the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, water privatization, and more. We'll put a link to that article in the chat so you can check it out later. We also recently sat down with our founder and executive director, Winona Howder, about the beginnings of Food and Water Watch, and we talked to her about why this work is so essential and what it takes to keep fighting when the odds are against us. We'll put a link to that article in the chat, and if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to check that out as well. I'm also very excited to tell you about our upcoming benefit event. In celebration of our 20th anniversary and as a way to gather together in community and solidarity, we're holding a benefit event that I would love for you to join. We'll have a reception in New York City on May 6th and a virtual conference on May 13th. I'm excited to host keynote speakers Zephyr Teachout and Senator Cory Booker, as well as a number of exciting presenters and panelists. Please consider joining us for both the in-person reception in New York and the virtual conference here in the comfort of your own home. We'll put a link in the chat for more information. And if you are new to Livable Future Live, welcome. This is our monthly virtual education series. Each month, we focus on a different topic relevant to our livable future. Today, as you know, we will be talking about microplastics in our water. And next month, on Wednesday, April 23rd, we are excited to be hosting a film screening of The Jungle, followed by a talk back with the film director, Matt Weschler. This modern-day take on Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel unravels centuries of greed and exploitation in America's meat industry, calls into question the profiteering of ecosystems, and reveals how Indigenous knowledge may hold the key to creating an equitable food system for both people and the planet. We're really excited to be providing this early screening and talk back with the film director. I hope you'll join us for that event, and we'll put a sign-up link for that in the chat as well. A few quick notes about Zoom before we get started. If you'd like to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, click Show Captions in your Zoom toolbar. We'll add instructions for that in the chat as well. Please use this chat box throughout the evening to share your thoughts and reactions to what you're hearing. This chat is also where we will share information and links, so keep an eye out for those. You'll also see a Q&A box. If you have questions for any of our speakers today, please put those in the Q&A box so we are sure to see them. We have set aside time at the end for Q&A. And finally, I am recording this event, and I will share the recording with you in an email I will send out tomorrow. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are in a very challenging time in history. We are seeing atrocities in the news daily, and it isn't slowing down. We're coming together in community today with a diverse set of backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences, but with a common belief in the importance of fighting for clean water, a sustainable food system, and a livable future for all. As you share your thoughts and your questions in the comments, please make sure to keep them respectful. We do have someone monitoring the chat, and we'll ask anyone not abiding by this request to leave the event. There is no doubt that this has already been a challenging year, and it will continue to be challenging under a Trump presidency. But Food and Water Watch has a 20-year history of winning, and we're prepared to defend the strides we've made. We will continue to take on factory farms, protect our water from toxic chemicals, fight for a future free of fossil fuels, and stand up against corporate climate scams. It's in coming together and joining forces that we get this work done. There are many ways for you to get involved with our work, including joining our volunteer network, attending our events, and making a donation. And in honor of World Water Day coming up this Saturday, all gifts you give today are being matched 2-to-1. In fact, everything you give through Saturday will be matched dollar for dollar. We don't take any corporate funding, and so we're not beholden to any special interests other than our community and our environment. So our support comes from people like you, and your support now makes us stronger for the many fights ahead. So thank you so much for your generosity. And now I would like to introduce you to today's topic. It's a sobering one, but every time I watch a presentation or read a report from either of this afternoon's speakers, I'm not only impressed by the depth of their knowledge and the importance of their work, I also walk away with a much better understanding of the topics they've covered. Today, we're going to be talking about microplastics in our water, the human health risks and what we're doing about it, and how you can join the fight. And I'm very happy to introduce to you Food and Water Watch researcher Natalie Balbuena and Public Water for All campaign director Mary Grant. Natalie and Mary, thank you so much for being here with us today. For all of you tuning in from home, excuse me, if you have questions as we go, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box. We do have time set aside for your questions at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Mary to get us started.
Thank you, Janine, and thank you to everyone on this call for joining us today to celebrate World Water Day, which is coming up this Saturday. In 1993, the United Nations declared March 22nd to be World Water Day, and it is now one of the largest international observances. For more than 30 years, nations, communities, and individuals have marked this day with songs, events, and actions to call attention to the importance of our water. So we are at a precarious moment for clean water in our country. And you may have heard last month about how we're fighting back against Musk and Trump's efforts to eliminate clean water protections. But today we want to share a proactive vision for how we're continuing to build toward our goal of safe water for all. World Water Day is a moment to celebrate and cherish our water. Water is the lifeblood of our communities, and it is our most basic public resource. World Water Day is also an occasion to draw attention to the global water crisis. Around the world, more than 2 billion people lack access to safe water, with devastating consequences for their lives and well-being. In the United States, too, we know that as many as 150 million people, nearly half the country, could have unreliable access to safe water because of toxic contamination. 9 million homes still receive water through dangerous lead service lines. More than 140 million people receive drinking water contaminated with toxic PFAS. And about 7% of our nation's community water systems violate basic health-based regulations in any given year. And on top of all of that, we're learning more about an emerging threat to our drinking water: microplastics. Today, we're going to dive into this last water threat, microplastics, and share our 7-state strategy to jumpstart the process of addressing these plastic particles in our water. Natalie will provide an in-depth overview of the health risks of microplastics, and our volunteer leader, Annalise, will share more about our work on the ground. And we'll wrap it up with some ways that you can help and get involved. We'll also take some questions at the end. Now, I want to turn it over to Natalie, our lead researcher on microplastics, to get us started by answering that simple question. Wait, let's start. What are microplastics?
Thanks so much, Mary. So microplastics are essentially tiny particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters. They come in all sorts of shapes, all sorts of colors, and all sorts of compositions in terms of material. There are 2 ways that you can form microplastics. You can either make them to be that tiny. So I want you to think about the little microbeads in your exfoliating body wash, for instance. Or more commonly, what you have is a cycle of bigger plastics being degraded into these tinier microplastics. And this happens with things like contact with UV rays or wind or water or just in general, like any sort of contact that will degrade the microplastics. Since microplastics are just smaller plastics, they will carry many of the same additives that larger plastics have. So this could be coatings to make it water resistant, like toxic PFAS chemicals, or other more commonly heard additives like BPA. Their tiny size is what makes them really, really ingestible. It's what makes them really able to flow and infiltrate water systems and traverse into the tiniest crevices in our homes. Since they're that tiny, microplastics are essentially everywhere, and they're difficult to quantify for that same reason. We're really only beginning to catch on in terms of research, and there's a huge wave of that coming in almost like every month. But what we do know is that they are in our soils, in our crops, in our plants, and in the animals that interact with the soil. They've been found to uptake microplastics into them. Microplastics have been found in foods like lettuce, in fruits, and in our meat supplies. They also have been found in the air, which is why inhalation is considered a route to exposure. And concerningly so, they have been found in our water. The most predominant type of microplastic found in water are actually microfibers from laundry. And microplastics themselves have been found in almost every water body you can think of on the earth, even the Arctic oceans way up north in the south. And in parallel, they've also been found in a lot of drinking water samples globally. And yes, this is something that we are dealing with in the US, very much so. Drinking water remains one of the main ways that we can actually ingest microplastic into our bodies. So a bit more on microplastics and drinking water. The reason why it's found in our drinking water to begin with is it's such a pervasive problem, but we also have our treatment plants, our wastewater treatment plants that can't filter out 100% of microplastics. And you might think that, okay, if there's microplastics in my tap water, then I'll drink bottled water. And bottled water is not the solution here. Most bottled water contains tap water anyways, but studies have come out showing that bottled water will add more microplastics into your bodies compared to tap. One study found that regularly using bottled water could add upwards of 680% more microplastics in your system. Other water bottle studies have found that the amount of microplastics in water bottles are far more greater than those in tap. Oh, sorry, and back to Mary.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So you just heard from Natalie about how widespread microplastics are. There is plastic in our drinking water. So what do we do about it? We have a plan. In January of this year, we launched our Stop Microplastics Now campaign to bring together volunteers from across the country to work to fast track getting actual protections against microplastics in our water. The federal government has not acted to regulate these plastic pieces in our water, so we developed a coordinated strategy. One of the first steps towards regulation is finding out how many microplastics are in our drinking water. That's why we are organizing to force the EPA to monitor for microplastics in our drinking water. And despite what is happening with the federal government right now is still the right moment to make this ask. That's because every 5 years, regardless of who is president or their priorities, the EPA is required by law to come up with a list of up to 30 unregulated contaminants to monitor for in drinking water. This is the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The EPA is developing the next list of contaminants to test for the 6th round of monitoring right now. It seeks to propose this list by the end of this year and then finalize it by the end of next year. Last year, the EPA began considering whether or not to include microplastics in the next round of testing. But it faced pushback from the plastics industry, the chemical industry, and we know the regulatory process can really drag out. We don't want any more delays. That's why last November, Food and Water Watch submitted a legal petition to the EPA asking for microplastics to be included in the next round of monitoring. This was signed on by 175 organizations across the country. In this petition, our legal team established the reasons why the EPA can and should monitor for microplastics in our water. You're probably wondering, but what about the change in administration? Will a Trump EPA monitor for microplastics? Let's be direct. No, not on its own. It seems very unlikely that the Trump EPA will expand protections without public and legal pressure. The current administration has a stated goal of deregulation. Last week, the current EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin, stated that his goal was to promote business and touted what he called the biggest deregulatory action in US history. And this is a major change in tone for the head of an agency that is supposed to protect our water and environment. Trump has also paused all new regulations and ordered that agencies like EPA have to toss out 10 regulations for every new one adopted. Musk and Trump are also trying to eliminate core functions of the EPA, seeking to slash its budget by 65% and firing the workforce en masse. First, focusing on environmental justice workers and then probationary workers. And yesterday it was revealed that the EPA seeks to eliminate its research and development arm and fire more than 1,000 scientists. So no, we can't expect Trump's EPA to move toward monitoring microplastics on our own. But we also shouldn't just sit around and wait for the next 4 years to wait for a change in administration. But if the Trump EPA seems unlikely to act, what can be done now? This is where the next phase of our strategy comes in. We are asking the governors of at least 7 states to step up to formally petition the EPA to include microplastics in the next round of water monitoring. Our legal team found a special provision in the Safe Drinking Water Act that requires the EPA to include a contaminant on that monitoring list if the EPA receives a petition from at least 7 governors. Or the EPA has to justify how including microplastics would bump off a more pressing contaminant from that list of 30 to test for. So we just need 7 governors to petition for it, and we can get the ball rolling toward regulation. You can see the legalese on the screen right here. It's clear. It's a clear requirement for the EPA, and it grants a good deal of power to those 7 governors. To our knowledge, this would be the first time that provision of law would be used since it was codified in 1996. This is huge, and it's especially important in the moment that we're in. Just 7 governors can step up and champion microplastic-free water. We have a list of the top 12.5 governors who would be most likely to join this petition based on several factors, including actions that they've taken on plastics in their state and our network of volunteers and allies in those states. The moment is now to monitor for microplastics. We can compel the Trump EPA to take action by leveraging the power of the states. This is a really winnable issue, and it will increase public knowledge about microplastics. The timeline for the campaign is clear. We want the governor's petition submitted by the end of this year before the proposal is released. We have several months to get at least 7 governors on board to formally petition the EPA. The final rule will come out at the end of next year, and testing for microplastics should begin in 2028. This opportunity is too big to pass up. This is a once in a 5-year chance, and we can't wait any longer for safe microplastic-free water. So we have a couple months to ramp up pressure, and with all of you on this call, we have a real chance to be proactive, not just defensive, and move the needle for safe water in our country. Our volunteers are making enormous strides to get governors on board, and Elise will talk about this organizing work more later and the critical role that volunteers play in making our water safe for all. But first, I want to turn it back to Natalie to explain why this is important by providing an in-depth insight into the emerging research on the health harms of microplastics.
Thanks, Mary. I'll be walking you guys through some of the health impacts here, and there are quite a bit, so bear with me. I want you guys to remember that microplastics, they are just small plastics. And what are plastics coated with? You know, the things I mentioned earlier, toxic chemicals, things like PFAS, forever chemicals, BPA. And these chemicals are released as the plastic degrades over time, essentially. Um, I'm not sure what's going on with my audio. I will try to speak a bit louder. I'm sorry. Um, yeah, I'm not sure what is going on with my volume per se. I'm seeing the microphone go all the way up, but yeah, so these chemicals that are released essentially degrade over time, and the science on how this impacts our health is essentially growing every day. A lot of those studies actually began around animal studies. There's a large foundation of that that demonstrates how microplastics have negatively impacted various animal organs like the spleen, the liver, the lungs, but also how they've impacted overall systems like the cardiovascular system and endocrine systems. In humans, they've been found almost everywhere in our bodies, from our organs to our blood, our like placentas, semen, muscle tissues. And on a cellular level, they have been found to be damaging to actual individual cells. They induce cell stress and eventually cell death. They've also been found to compromise our immune system, induce conditions such as polycystic ovarian syndrome, alter sperm production, and impact prenatal genital development. Microplastics have also been found in the brain. And yes, I did just say the brain, where they can actually accumulate. Studies have estimated that amount that accumulates in the brain to have increased by roughly 50% from 2016 to 2024. Microplastic exposure in adults has also driven a huge concern for fetal and infant development, particularly when it comes to pregnant women, as microplastics have also been found to harm and delay fetal development. In infants, scientists found around 10 to 20 times more microplastics in their feces compared to adults. And so that kind of generates this larger concern for, you know, children being exposed to more microplastics at an earlier developmental stage. Microplastics exposure has also been linked to possible lung and colon cancers as a result of this accumulation that happens in our organs. And since microplastics have been found in our blood, scientists have been able to actually link them to damage in our cardiovascular health, with documented increased incidences of stroke. And all this stuff, and there's more issues that I haven't touched on, and there's also this larger issue of nanoplastics that's sort of lying beneath the surface of the sea of microplastics that I have not touched on. Nanoplastics are even smaller than microplastics, you know, nearing the microscopic range, and the implications there are massive for essentially tinier particles to enter our bodies. I know that in general, this has been a lot that I've outlined, a lot of health impacts, a lot of fear, but what I'm really trying to emphasize here is that small is not actually small. There is, unfortunately, a lot that we cannot control about how we're exposed or what's already in our bodies, but we can essentially just try to arm ourselves with the knowledge that science provides us to kind of help us make actionable change, informed consumer choices, and to gear our support for people who will actually work to make a difference in this field. Fighting for any amount of less microplastics will make a big difference. And that's what makes the work that we're trying to do here so crucial. Annalise will tell you a bit more about that.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Mary. Like Natalie just said, that's a lot to take in. It's hard to hear that I might have microplastics in my blood and in my brain. But the more that I hear, the more I want to learn so that I can protect myself and so that I can protect my community. And today we are privileged to have someone here to tell us her story about hearing the same message and what she did and is doing in response. Please allow me to introduce Annalise Adams. Annalise is a volunteer on the Water Action Team who is joining us today to talk about how she became involved in the fight against microplastics. Annalise, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Janine, for having me.
Annalise, in preparation for today's event, I told my colleagues that I thought it would be nice to talk to someone who's joined us in this work as a volunteer, and your name came up right away because of your involvement in this campaign. Can you tell us where you're calling in from and what kind of background you have in environmental activism?
Sure. So today I'm calling in from Auburn, New York, which is located in the Finger Lakes region of New York. And in regards to my background in environmental activism, I always had an interest in it, but I was under the impression, that the only way that I could be involved in it was by attending protests and rallies. And so thankfully I was wrong about that around 2021, because that's when I got involved with Food and Water Watch.
Nice. And when did you or how did you first learn about microplastics, and what made you decide to join the Water Action volunteer team?
So the first time that I learned about microplastics was actually during the call that Mary hosted. She went and explained everything that was in the water quality reports. And I just thought that call was so informative because prior to that, I had no knowledge that there was such a report that existed. And that compelled me to go ahead and sign up for the water action team that they had. And I did that in the Slack chat, or one of the Slack channels. And so after joining the team, I, worked with the organizers of Food and Water Watch, and I helped support for the PFAS Action Act. And I did that by helping to collect signatures last year.
Nice. And so now you're part of the volunteer team. Can you tell us any more about the work that you're doing, and if there are challenges or favorite parts, or what you think, why is this work important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for the microplastics campaign, I've gotten involved locally in my area in New York, and I've done so by reaching out to neighboring organizations that had similar missions to Food and Water Watch. And by doing so, I went ahead and sent them our sign-on letter to Governor Hochul, and thankfully it was a good response because thus far we've gotten like 50 plus groups signed on right now. And so far, I think one of the challenges for me during this launch is just when I do outreach to organizations and they don't respond. But thankfully, um, on the flip side, one of my favorite parts is that when I get to collaborate with other volunteers like Victoria Augustine and Betty Winkler, who had connections to organizations that didn't respond. And so that was my favorite part, because then it turns out those groups that didn't respond initially, they ended up replying after other volunteers pitched in and helped. So, and as far as like why this is important to me, fighting for, particularly water, it's important because it's so essential to life and it affects everything, just as Natalie explained, human health, animals, plants, the climate. And so in addition to that, though, I think it's important for me because I just want to know that I'm helping for future generations to have access to clean and safe drinking water. So I want to do everything that I can.
Yeah, nice. And finally, what would you say to anyone on this call who's interested in joining the fight against microplastics in our water?
Yeah. Well, step one, it's definitely to be aware of the problems that one is facing in your community. And then step two, find out how you can do something about it. And the most important thing to remember is the importance of collaboration. So, reaching out to volunteers that you work with, whether it be here with Food and Water Watch or even just other organizations that are in your region that have similar missions. And then, as they say, the teamwork makes the dream work. And so that's my advice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Annalise. Thanks for your time on this call, and thank you for all that you are doing to help protect our water from microplastics.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And now let's bring it back to Mary to tell us a few things that we can all do to join the fight against microplastics in our water. Mary, I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Janine, and thank you to Annalise again for joining us today and for all your work on the Stop Microplastics Now campaign. For everyone on the call, there are three key actions you can take today to help with the campaign. The first one is to send a message to your governor and ask them to be one of our 7 champions for microplastic-free water by joining the formal petition to EPA. A link is in the chat box where you can take action now. These links will also be shared with you after the call in a follow-up email. The second action you can take is to join Annalise and our other volunteers on our water action team. This team provides critical support for all of our water campaigns, including Stop Microplastics Now. A link is in the chat box where you can sign up today to keep up to date on our volunteer opportunities for our water campaigns. And lastly, you can sign up to join our next Stop Microplastics Now campaign call on April 8th at 8 p.m. Eastern. On this campaign call, we will be digging in deeper into this campaign, and in particular, we'll be planning for Earth Day events and collecting petitions. So please join this team and learn what you can do in your community to make a big impact nationwide and protecting our drinking water from microplastics. And I want to thank you all again for your time today, and I hope you will join us in taking action for microplastic-free water. I'll turn it back to Janine now to see if you have any questions for Natalie and me.
Great. Thank you, Mary, for going over direct actions we can take. Like Mary said, we added links in the chat, and you can follow those links to sign up for each of those actions. Thank you, Natalie, as well, for sharing what our research is telling us about microplastics so far. It's a lot to take in, and it's a lot of information and important work. In addition to the actions Mary just went over, there is one more important way you can make a difference in this work, and that is supporting us with a donation. It's people like you on this call who make this work possible by signing up, by showing up, and by making gifts when you can. We know that our water and the protections that we're fighting for are under attack. Saturday is World Water Day, but Trump and Musk are not celebrating the holiday the way we are. Their agenda is to make our water less safe and less accessible, but we're not backing down. We will continue to fight Trump and Musk, and your generosity helps fuel this fight. So thank you. And again, in honor of World Water Day, all gifts are being matched through Saturday. So everything you give through this Saturday, it's like giving twice. So thank you again for your generosity, and thanks for being here. We now have a bunch of time for questions, so let's move on to questions. I see that a number of questions have already come in. As a reminder, if you have questions for Mary or Natalie, please type those in the Q&A box so that we are sure to see them, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So let's see. Let's start with some questions about health impacts. Natalie, Ron Span is asking about health risks for the elderly population. Do we know about health risks that are specific to the age, to people's age?
Yeah, short answer is no, we don't. There have not been any studies that have examined microplastic impacts on elderly people. There have been studies on, conversely, infants, children, just because their early exposure to microplastics at such a young age while, their bodies are still developing has impacts further down the road. But yeah, unfortunately, no, we might see one in the future, but for now, we don't know yet.
Thank you. And I think you've alluded to this a little bit, but it's new enough that some of the answers we'll have is that we don't know yet, but that's why we're studying it. So another question that we had is from Richard asking if we know anything about microplastics as estrogen mimickers.
When it comes to microplastic or how it relates to estrogen, what has been confirmed is that microplastics do in fact disrupt the hormonal reproductive type systems that we have in our bodies, disrupting a lot of the pituitary, thyroid glands, things like that. As for whether or not it actually mimics estrogen, I have not reviewed or seen any studies on my end, but I'm sure that's also going to come out soon as well.
Thank you. And we have a number of questions too, asking a little bit more about specific harms that have been demonstrated when we are seeing microplastic accumulation.
I cannot possibly name all of the harms that I have read about, unfortunately. I will say this, simply put, microplastics are a foreign item that are in our bodies. And so whenever you think about that, you have to think of how that induces stress in your body. And then you have to think about that and where exactly are microplastics within our bodies. So if it's in our hearts, in our bloodstreams, in our livers, I think off the top of my head that I remember most recently, accumulation in the liver decreases liver function. I know it acts as a neurotoxin, and that relates to the accumulation in the brain that has been observed. But again, I can't possibly name all of them here. I would spend the rest of this webinar just talking about it.
Thank you. Let's move on to some questions about what can we do. Mary, could you give kind of an overview of how community events and how to have community events and education for students and neighbors?
Sure, we've seen a lot of questions about what you can do, how to hold an event on this issue. So I would encourage everyone again to join our volunteer network, our water action team during our next call. We have a team of fantastic organizers led by Michelle and Nisha who will walk you through hosting these events. So I really do encourage you to join our volunteer network, and we will provide resources to help you set up events to petition to get microplastics monitored by EPA.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Could you talk a little bit more about what's being done about the dumping of these plastics in waters and removing them?
Yeah, that's a great point, because what we're talking about is monitoring for microplastics in our water. But if we step back a little bit, there shouldn't be microplastics in our water. So we need to stop the use of single-use plastics. We need policies that prevent plastic pollution in the first place, and we are working on that as well. So the monitoring for microplastics we see as part of that broader campaign push about educating people about single-use plastics and the harm of plastics, harm of fossil fuel industry, and all of the plastics that are made from the fossil fuel industry. And also working toward a really tangential goal that we can all find out about microplastics in our water and take action to protect ourselves. But yes, we do need to stop the introduction of microplastics into our environment, stopping the use of single-use plastics, and minimizing plastic production across the country.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about what consumers can do to reduce the chance of microplastics in our food and water?
Sure. So we are actually going to release a news piece on our website shortly with 5 ways you can take action to protect yourself from microplastics. One of the big ones was what Natalie said earlier: don't use bottled water. Study after study after study has found that the number of microplastics in bottled water is just far greater than in our tap water. So that is the first thing I would encourage people to do: avoid bottled water, plastic, single-use bottled water. Another one is to avoid heating foods and plastics. That's another major source of microplastic contamination and the ingestion of microplastics. So avoid heating heating your food and plastic containers. Avoid tea bags that have plastic on them too, because again, it's in the heat and it causes the release of microplastics into the teas you drink. So avoid teas that have microplastic and plastic linings. So those are 3 of the ways you can avoid microplastics in your life: avoiding plastic utensils, plastic cooking utensils, avoid heating in plastic. But then also, I think I want to go back to the point I made earlier that what we really need to do is avoid all single-use plastic in our lives and to minimize plastic pollution in our environment.
Thank you. Let's move on to Natalie for a few questions here. I have a number of questions coming in about specific brands and water bottling companies. Now, we're saying it's best to not drink bottled water, but sometimes people do or feel they have to for whatever reason. Is there a way for us to know if bottled water is contaminated, whether it's bottled spring water or other bottled water?
So unfortunately with this, I have, I guess, some bad news. While there isn't a consumer study or any study that kind of has yet differentiated between, oh, what is maybe spring bottled water is different than other kinds of bottled water. We do have studies that point strongly to why, bottled water or other plastic packaged food items have a lot of microplastics to begin with. And it all boils down to how you interact with the plastic. So, for instance, a bag of chips, studies have found that when you open the bag of chips or you open any, that opening action is what creates the microplastics that'll sprinkle into your food or your chips. And so with water bottles, I mean, I have yet to come across a water bottle or a plastic water bottle that has a non-plastic cap option or way to open it. And that opening of it is what's going to introduce microplastics into the water bottle itself. So my short answer is I wouldn't say any bottled water brands are safe, unfortunately.
Interesting. Okay. What are the sources of microplastics? You got into this a little bit, but specifically the sources of microplastics in drinking water. Are they introduced through rain, canal transport, reservoirs, treatment equipment, or other avenues?
So when it comes to microplastics in water specifically, a huge source of that actually comes from our homes. Studies have shown that one of the biggest portions of microplastics in water is actually microfibers, and that comes from washing your clothes, things like that. Um, the way we interact with plastic items in our home, in the kitchen sink, things like that. And when it comes to sources outside of that, you have to think of essentially anything that is plastic that you interact with. Um, so synthetic clothes, clothes that are made with synthetic materials, polyester, for instance. You have, plastic toys that children play with. That's another source. Plastic containers you use on a day-to-day basis. They're all sorts of sources, really. Just, you trace it back to plastic at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you. I have a few questions coming in about hard plastic containers, reusable plastic containers, things that are marketed as being more safe in that way. How can we tell if those are safe to use?
So this goes back to the previous question I answered about bottled water, and I think when possible, I would definitely try to opt out for something that is non-plastic. Um, but if you don't have that option, or if you really want to try and reuse maybe like a sturdy plastic container you have, um, it all comes down to how you take care of it, how you interact with it. Don't wipe it down or clean it with anything abrasive, really be mindful of how often you use it, how you use it, how you clean it, how you care for it, because there are studies that show that that makes a difference in the amount of microplastics that are released from items like that. So it's all about, I guess, individual necessity, like, do I need to replace this? And how often do I need to use this? How do I care for this?
Yeah, thank you. Let's move on to, I have so many questions about filtration. And I'll start with the first one here. Does boiling the water remove the microplastics?
There is one study that I have seen so far about this, and their conclusion was that yes, it does help remove microplastics from tap water. But keep in mind that it is one study, so of course for things like this, we do need to wait for, other people to replicate, to kind of like take different angles on it. But it is promising. That is, their results in their trials and everything show that yes, boiling water did decrease the amount of microplastics in tap water.
Great, thank you. And so we also have a lot of questions about, specific filtration systems. But can you tell us what's the best way to filter out microplastics, both in our homes and also if we're traveling?
The best way, I'm going to speak to first the at-home part. Is to get a point of use filter. So when I say point of use, I mean something that you essentially attach under your kitchen sink, for instance, or under whatever sink that you're using. Um, you buy one of those kinds of filters and make sure that it has a filter certified by the NSF to filter out for microplastics. Um, that is the best possible way that you could. I know that the NSF has a handy dandy tool online that you can search for different kinds of brands or companies making filters with that certification, or you could just, do your own online search on Google for that. Yeah, and when it comes to traveling, and this in a way also goes back to this at-home filter part. be wary of any filter that claims that, oh, we filter out microplastics. Like while traveling, for instance, okay, maybe you think of things like the Life Straw, which is portable. And I checked earlier, they do have a claim that says they remove microplastics, but nowhere on their website does it say they use a filter certified by the NSF. So I would again caution for that. And while traveling, reusable water bottle, stainless steel water bottle, refill water as best you can. Um, Always have water bottles be the last option.
Thank you. I have a number of questions that are all kind of revolving around this idea of how do we know what's contaminated. Could you address any differences that you've seen between municipal water and private well water regarding microplastics?
So we have studies, or we don't have studies yet determining that difference or like analyzing that way or kind of documenting that, so to speak. So we can't say, or I can't say anything for certainty on my part. What I can generally say is, if you want to have an idea of does my system have water in it? More than likely, unfortunately, the answer is going to be yes, just because of the pervasiveness of this type of little particle, how essentially it's gone unchecked for a long time. Generally, you could think of other sources that are outside of your home, being like landfills that could possibly leach these things into the ground, which then leach into the groundwater, and that cycle continues into your drinking water. You could think of production facilities. You could think of off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything else at the moment, but those generally, like location-wise, might give you an idea. But unfortunately, this is all still like within the US specifically too, something that we are trying to get the EPA to monitor, for instance. So, yeah.
Wow. And can you address anything you know about the difference between like a rural wells versus city or town wells?
On the topic of wells, that would really relate to groundwater contamination. And from what I have seen in other global studies, because I have not seen a US study that was looking at US groundwater, microplastics have been found in groundwater. So the likely conclusion to be determined by future science is that yes, it would include most wells linked to groundwater.
Thank you. I have a question asking about microplastic bioaccumulation, both through water and through on-land food chains. Are we seeing this?
Yes, they do accumulate. They have been found to accumulate in aquatic food chains. A lot of studies on aquatic food chains. I don't recall seeing a study on like terrestrial food chains specifically, but that has been studied for at least aquatic food chains.
Thank you. And do you know anything about mountain stream water? Are there microplastics in snowmelt?
In snowmelt particularly, I'm not sure, but I do know, they have been found in the Arctic. And they have been found in clouds, they have been found in the rain. So safe to say, yes, if not, again, to be proved by a future study.
Thank you. I have one more follow-up question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to some questions for Mary. But a follow-up question, is it better to boil tap water versus buying bottled water?
I would say any option is better than bottled water. I mean, bottled water is your last resort if you have nothing else to rely on. Again, there is so much we can't control. So if bottled water is your only option, don't feel horrible about that. And again, pointing back to that one study that came out recently about boiling tap water in reducing microplastics. Again, that needs to be further studied, further supported, but it is promising. And so in that sense, I would say that it's better to go with tap water, period. And if you'd like to boil it, there is no harm in boiling it. So
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. That's a lot of information. I really appreciate it. Mary, we have a number of questions that have come in about testing and what we can do. How do we know? Nancy says, I want to know what's in my water. I think that's something we're all feeling right now. Is this being tested right now in local municipalities?
Unfortunately, right now, home testing options are limited and the number of water systems testing for it is limited. It's mostly academic labs right now. And that's why it's so important that we get it added to the next round of testing by EPA, because we really need to ramp up testing capabilities nationwide. And getting it added to the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule will go a long way toward expanding testing capabilities nationwide. That's because we always recommend using state certified labs for any type of drinking water quality test. These are just the gold standard, and we want to make sure we're recommending something that's been certified to give you the right result. We can't weigh in on home testing options or mail-in options. We really do recommend those state certified labs. California is the first state in the United States and the first in the world to actually give official accreditation for microplastics testing in drinking water. At least 2 labs in the state of California are certified to be able to test for microplastics in drinking water. And the EPA right now is in the process of developing a microplastics methodology that will, again, ramp up testing capabilities nationwide. So this is what we're hoping for. That's why we really do need this added to the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. We all have a fundamental right to know what's in our drinking water, and we need EPA to step it up.
Thank you. Let's see. Joyce is asking, who is going to hold our government leaders accountable for destroying our water and prioritizing greed and profits over people?
We all are together. That's our strategy. That's our theory of change, is regular people coming together to work for the change that's necessary to protect our essentials, safe food, clean water for everyone. So it's all of us coming together. You can join us through our volunteer network. You can take action on our petition, but it's really about regular people coming together to hold these officials accountable. It's making the calls, it's sending the emails, it's showing up at town halls. It's really about building this community to hold them accountable and to work for the policies that we need for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I have a number of people asking to mention again the states that you've mentioned earlier, and we will send that out in an email tomorrow as well. But could you say again, who are the 7 governors and how many of these governors have already signed the petition?
We're still working to get a governor on board to be the lead one. We're 2 months in and we're ramping up a lot of the pressure, setting up meetings with these governor's offices. So we have a set of 7 top tier targets. It includes California because they're the first in the nation to already require monitoring for microplastics in drinking water. Maine, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Washington, states that have shown leadership and weighing in on public health protections, drinking water protections, and being willing to challenge EPA on some of these issues. The next level, we have Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where we think that we can also reach some of these governors as well. So we are working across the country to try to get volunteers engaged, getting petitions collected, getting groups on sign-on letters, and setting up these meetings with these governors' offices so we can get that formal petition submitted to the EPA by the end of this year.
Thank you. And can you tell me, we're hearing about EPA cuts. How is that related to this work?
That's very important. So this is why it makes our work so much more important, because of these EPA cuts, in particular, the ones for the research and development arm of EPA. I'm very worried about. This is the arm that is supposed to be developing these microplastics methodologies to standardize how we test for it, how labs can get accredited. And if more than 1,000 toxicologists, scientists are taken away out of the EPA, it will really severely limit their capacity to step up and monitor for this in absence of public pressure and the governors intervening to apply pressure on. So the cuts at EPA, we're tracking them very closely. We're very worried about it. They have also proposed a 65% budget cut to the EPA across the board that'll have devastating consequences for the safety of our water. More than 60% of EPA's budget, had a $10 billion budget last year. More than 60% of that went to states and local governments for Superfund cleanups of contaminated sites, for state and local assistance grants, for clean water projects. So the bulk of this is actually getting out to states and local communities to clean up our environment and our water. So this cutting back these funds by 65% will really just harm communities across the country. So we have a plan too. You might have heard about it on the previous Livable Future Live about how we're going to hold Congress members accountable to stop some of these most damaging cuts.
Thank you. Let's see, we do have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to ask some of these follow-up questions that have come in. Again, if you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We probably have time for one or two more questions here. Let's see, this one goes to Natalie. Someone's asking about if you're boiling the water to reduce microplastics, they must go somewhere. They can't just disappear. Do you have any advice about how to monitor that or what to do about that?
For that, I will actually link that one study that I mentioned, since it's just one study and I mentioned it so much and it's pretty easy to read through. But let me just find it really quickly. I believe they did mention kind of like it's basically the residue will what's the word for it? Pool at the bottom. I'm not sure. I don't know what the word is, but it'll stay there and you just pour out the water they're using. And but yeah, I'll link it in the chat for everybody.
Great, thank you. And let's see. Susan is asking, can New York State pass a law to require testing drinking water for microplastics, even if the EPA doesn't include it on their even if the EPA doesn't include it on their list of chemicals for testing?
Absolutely. California has done that as well. They did that several years ago. They passed a law to require the state to start monitoring for microplastics in their drinking water. What we're seeing is California often leads the way on some of these environmental issues. So there's a model out there. New York State could take action on its own, especially at this time when we're seeing a lot of regulations being gutted by the Trump EPA. We're hoping that more states will step up to fill that gap and protect our water. We're also seeing some of the regulations around PFAS being codified at the state level as well. California proposed legislation very recently to set their own drinking water standards at the EPA standards because of fears that the Trump administration might remove those PFAS standards. So again, this is a place where states can step up. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, you're allowed to have stronger state laws, not weaker ones. So this is a place where states can really step it up and protect their water at the state level.
Thank you so much. We're coming up on time, so I just want to give you both a chance to say if there's anything else that you want to share with people before we close out today.
I just wanted to thank you all again for joining us. And I know this is a moment where people might be fearful about the future of our water, about the future of our environment, but there's actions that we can take together, coming together to build this power that we need to pass the policies that we need. And there's a place for us to take action at the local and the state level to kind of fill in some of those gaps. So I know that it might be alarming to read the national news, but keep in mind that we have a plan, we have a strategy, we can keep making progress for safe water for all. So as we celebrate World Water Day, we can commit ourselves to taking this action and protecting water for everyone.
Great. Thank you so much. So it is time for us to wrap this up, but please join me in thanking Mary Grant and Natalie Balbuena and Annalise Adams for joining us this evening. And thank you all for being here this evening. We can only do this work because of the support of our community. So thank you so much for being a part of it. Let's see a few things I'm going to share with you before we're done. If you would like to increase the impact we can have, remember that there is a 2-for-1 match through Saturday in honor of World Water Day. Every dollar you give is doubled, and those gifts help fund research that Natalie's doing and the actions that Mary highlighted today. And as I said before, we don't take any corporate funding, so we are not beholden to any special interests other than the health of our communities and our planet. Our support comes from people like you, and a gift today will help us to continue to do this important work. I hope to see you next month for our film screening of The Jungle and our talk back with the film director. We'll put a link in the chat to sign up for that. And last but certainly not least, please consider joining us for our upcoming 20th anniversary benefit event. I would love to meet you all in person in May in New York, and I hope to see every one of you here online for our virtual conference. Thank you all for joining me tonight, and watch your email inboxes. I will be sending out the recording of this event tomorrow. Take care and see you next time.